Hi, I'm Michael Forrester with WebAid Solutions, and welcome to I think a short webinar on the Elastic Kubernetes Service. I say short because it's an hour and 15 minutes, give or take, depending on questions. So thank you for participation. I see some people have posted in chat. Just know that I will pause every once in a while to check and see if there are any chat questions, but feel free to jump in at any time. I do consider myself to be a Kubernetes expert, having put it in production 3 or 4 times at scale for a variety of different companies. And even then, I feel like I'm still constantly relearning how Kubernetes functions and works. But we're here today to talk about the Elastic Kubernetes Service with AWS. So, but before I do that, I want to give you the cake before we get to the meal. So I'm going to talk about a few other things first. So, first, the objective is that I am going to talk a little bit about myself, why, just so I can get it out of the way, so you know who I am, why you might want to listen to me, or why you might not want to listen to me. You might not find any value in it, but just so you know my background and my context. So, and then we're going to talk about a little bit of collateral, and that's the cake. So I'm going to give you some gifts first. I already posted a link actually to the workshop inside the chat. It's the bit.ly link. I'll post it again in case you missed it and just joined. Right? Or to make it easier, because I probably ought to prefix it with this, right? There it is, active. So I'm going to talk a little bit of collateral about the things that you're just getting just for showing up to the webinar. I will tell you that I am like T.S. Eliot. I am a shameless stealer of things, with credit, of course, because I give credit where credit's due. So StackRox has been a great source of information about a lot of the stuff for this webinar, has been AWS, has been a number of other companies. So, you know, thanks to all of them. StackRox, by the way, is a container security company. Love them to death. I haven't really had a chance to use them in production, but I like their community engagement. So, talk about collateral. I'm going to go through the kind of official EKS features. I mean, literally like right off the features website. And then I'm going to talk about, I want to stop sharing my face. I'm going to talk about the different comparisons between EKS, AKS, and GKE, and then I'm going to give a short demo. Bear with me just 1 second. All right, sorry, we're back. Had a little technical difficulty. Let's see. Just want to make sure. Could someone post in the chat if you can hear me? Because there was a little technical difficulty there, and I'm getting some confirmation, but that was a little strange. All right, good. All right, let's keep going forward. Okay, so there's always a technical issue inside of a demo, so that's perfect. So we're going to talk about EKS. We're going to talk about a comparison, just a short one between EKS, AKS, and GKE. Those are the three, you know, I guess major public cloud providers. And then a short demo. We're going to see me fumble around with the EKS workshop, which I think is actually a great tool. So we're going to make sure that you're aware of that as well. And then, you know, there's going to be questions available throughout the entire course, but I'm going to make sure at the very end, if there's any questions that I can potentially answer for you, you can ask them. All right. So first, just a little bit about me. So I've been around since November of 1996 in the IT. So in the IT space, let's see, someone was asking about freebies. And so I've been in the industry for, I guess I'm working on my 24th, maybe 25th year. And, you know, about 10 years in, you know, AWS came out, so I started working a little bit in cloud. And then I got my real first production cloud job in 2011. And since November of 2011, I have been doing nothing but either hybridized cloud or dedicated cloud infrastructures. And then, of course, that made DevOps real for me because cloud came out. And then, you know, Kubernetes hit the scene about 2015. Docker had just come out a few years prior. Things started to mature around 2017. beginning of, we were hearing lots of rumblings, and then I worked for a company who was like, we want to go to Kubernetes, and very very much like this picture that's being shown here. It was a little bit kind of coming from the top down, right, where it wasn't necessarily a technical reason to go to Kubernetes. Someone just thought microservices were cool, and we were going to go to Kubernetes. Unfortunately, for that particular company, for business reasons, not technical reasons, they went out of business. But a small factor was the fact that we went to Kubernetes, and quite frankly, it wasn't ready, and we certainly weren't ready for Kubernetes. So I'm going to talk about EKS today because, in part, I'm a fan, especially for people who are first-time adopters of Kubernetes. And when we go through the collateral here in a second, I'll actually point out the Puppet Labs State of the Union report, which shows that Amazon EKS adoption is now higher by a few percentage points, just like 2, than plain vanilla Kubernetes adoption, because people are finding that adopting Kubernetes just raw, like you just get the open source and you set it up yourself, is a lot harder than you realize. And unless you're comfortable with it, and you're really savvy with APIs, and your infrastructure already has a bunch of problems figured out, like automation and monitoring and configuration management, going to Kubernetes is going to be a slap in the face to your operations and your DevOps teams. So just something to keep in mind as to why I'm promoting EKS to a certain degree. It's not just because I'm somehow a mysterious AWS fanboy. I'm a fan of whatever technology serves the business needs. But that's my little bit of my background, is that I've actually done this a number of times at scale. I was just recently the Honeywell architect for cloud and containers for them for global. So I have a resume that's ridiculously long and relatively useless because we really care about what we've been doing for the last 5 years. So anyway, that's about me. And so if you want to get in touch with me after this, it's michael.forrester@webhsolutions.com. I teach most of the AWS classes. I do most of the DevOps consulting. I'm really an advocate for DevOps, cloud, and containers inside WebH Solutions. And so that's what I do. So you can find me on LinkedIn under the Performing Pro, or you can, you send me a tweet. I'm at People Forrester. I'm more of a lurker on Twitter than I am a poster, but every once in a while I'll post on that. Okay, enough about me. The rest of this is all about you. Okay, so if you click this link that I shared in chat, what will happen is you will be taken to a Google Drive share, which you should see my smiling face in the upper right-hand side. And what will happen is that you will see that this presentation is listed there, right? So you can have access to a PDF copy of this. And then in addition, there's a number of other PDFs in here that are going to be extremely useful. And John asked a question about, will the session be recorded and shared, or the presentation? Yes and yes. So we're actually recording right now. And if you got the link, the bit.ly link that was posted just a minute ago, or the one that's in the presentation, you have access to the slide deck. So here it is again, just in case. All right, so the slide deck's completely in there. I threw in a Kubernetes cheat sheet because, I mean, come on, why not, right? I mean, seriously, we are talking about Kubernetes. Linux Academy is one of my favorite places to get that kind of thing. And they just merged with A Cloud Guru, so that's kind of cool. But what's in here that I think is super important, even before we get into the meat and potatoes about Kubernetes and EKS and whatnot, is that there's a Puppet Labs State of the Industry report in here, which I think is very fascinating. So this would be, I think, fall of 2019. And what's interesting about this report is that it talks about how the EKS adoption has gone through the roof. And so it's got a wealth of information in here, depending on how you view or look at Puppet Labs. But adoption of Kubernetes and automation and other components has gone through the roof. But for the first year, EKS adoption, Elastic Kubernetes with AWS, is now higher than plain vanilla Kubernetes. And it's only a few percentage points, so I think statistical deviation, but it's jumped massively from the 2018 report. So actually, I'm kind of scrolling down fast, and you guys are like, what is he doing? But let me see if I can get to the page in question. Oh, where is it? I seem to have lost it, and now I'm unprepared. So I apologize. But I highly recommend that you take a look at the report. It kind of reveals like what the state of Kubernetes adoption is, the state of DevOps is. In addition, a lot of the content around evaluating the top Kubernetes providers is in here, including some feature differences. Just beware, because they are all going headstrong and fast on Kubernetes. So this information, even though I think it's only like a week or two old, could already be out of date. So there's a security evaluation guide. There's a buyer's guide to Kubernetes that was published by Kong, who's my favorite API gateway lifecycle management tool. Love those guys. And then StackRox, who I mentioned before, who provides runtime security for containers, and I love those guys. And they publish out a bunch of stuff like the state of container security, Kubernetes settings, etc. The other thing is in here is that I put a couple of other EKS presentations, including some links of interest. So if you want to see the latest EKS announcements, if you want features, workshop, most of what I'm going to talk about today, there are going to be some links in here, and I'll add links as people ask questions. So, and so if you follow that bit.ly link that's been posted in the chat, you'll get access to it. And we'll send an email out afterwards, so you will have the link as well. So you'll get the presentation, you'll get the recordings, you'll get everything. So you don't have to worry. You'll get all of the information. It will be emailed to you as an attendee if you haven't already picked it up in chat. Good. Any questions thus far? Excellent. Okay. So I didn't actually add a specific link to the report, but it's inside the collateral that will be sent out. So we'll send out a follow-up so you'll get it. Okay. I'm a big fan of The Mandalorian, by the way. Obviously, Baby Yoda is blowing up the internet. And by the way, just as a word to say this, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you're staying safe and healthy in the face of this global pandemic. My heart goes out to anybody who's dealing with sick kids and new spaces. So, yeah. So just know people are out there grateful for your health. All right, so let's talk about Kubernetes. So I'm assuming if you came to this workshop, you know Kubernetes already, but that may not be true, actually. You might be like, wow, this crazy guy was offering EKS, so let's go talk to him. So I think the thing to know is that Kubernetes is a container orchestrator. That's really what it does. So its job is to scale, deploy, host, respond, monitor, right, to basically manage the deployment of containers, I think, in both production and non-production environments, whether it's in the cloud or whether it's on your on-premise data center. So, I mean, it's open source. It was originally done by Google. I think it was called Borg, and then it was Project 7 of 9. Obviously, there were a bunch of Trekkies there, which, you know, hey, kudos to them, right? But Google, you know, needed a way to deploy isolated workloads, really process isolation, because that's really what containers are. It's not really full virtual machine isolation. It's actually process isolation. But they needed a way to deploy that at scale and in mass, because I'm sure, as you can imagine, Google has probably a lot of backend infrastructure. And they needed to create a homogeneous, like something that was similar abstraction layer across all of these different types of hardware, because they didn't necessarily want to have the developers create like different binaries for different flavors and whatnot. So Kubernetes was kind of born out of this need to manage the portability of these processes and microservices that Google was creating. Now, that being said, you know, Kubernetes consists of master nodes and application nodes. And the master nodes do what you think master nodes would do. They monitor the system, they schedule things, they, you know, create configuration, they see if things are healthy, they bring things up and down. And the application nodes are the work nodes. They're the worker bees. So their job is to host containers which sit in what's called pods. Now you might say, well, Michael, why are they called pods exactly? I'm speculating on this, but I think it's because Docker symbol is a whale. And so you get pods of whales, you get multiple containers. I'm speculating on that, but I think that's why they call them pods. But pods contain at least one application or one database container. It just depends on what the application is. And usually there'll be other like sidecar containers in there, like monitoring, operations, security, whatnot. Some best practices is that you tend to run container in a pod. You don't tend to run more than one container in a pod, but quite frankly, there's been tons of use cases emerging where you actually might have multiple containers inside of a pod. And think of a pod in Kubernetes as just a logical unit of deployment, like a logical, in a sense, almost networking memory space that Kubernetes uses to deploy containers. Right? So when you deploy a pod, it's got at least one container in it, and you can have multiple pods on a node vertically. I'm going horizontally here. And you can have multiple copies of a container running in a pod, and that pod has been replicated horizontally across many different nodes. So, that's Kubernetes in a nutshell. This isn't really necessarily about Kubernetes. It's about the Kubernetes managed service, but just know that it's a workload orchestrator for containers. It's very robust. Just know that it does come at the cost of complexity, But complexity only exists for things that we're not familiar with. So that's why people are looking at managed services like EKS, because starting with your own manual implementation of Kubernetes may not be the best way to go if you're unfamiliar with Kubernetes. Let's talk more about that. Okay, so let's talk EKS. So all of the major cloud providers, the big three really, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they all have a service. And so this is Amazon's Elastic Kubernetes Service. Why? Because their marketing team likes Elastic. But the main reason is that in about this, summer of 2018, Amazon realized that they were already adopting and seeing Kubernetes adoption, and so they actually approached us early on when I was working for a company, and they said, "Hey, would you like a preview of Kubernetes?" And I was like, "Absolutely," because we're already heading down that road. And sure enough, in June of 2018, they announced the Elastic Kubernetes Service, and we use managed services because they save us something like time or configuration or operational overhead, like eating one of my people, if I'm running a DevOps team. And so what was funny is that when the service first came out, I don't know that it actually saved us anything. I mean, other than being able to run it on AWS's infrastructure and all the operational offloading that represented. Don't get me wrong, that's valuable. But in terms of like configuring Kubernetes, when the service first came out, it just wasn't, it was underwhelming. But they were in the race at that point in time. And I don't think Microsoft had an option. And of course, Google had theirs. So then the EKS service comes out and they're like, it's a fully managed service now, especially as of November of last year, which I'll mention briefly, because they added Fargate into their EKS offering. What is Fargate? Fargate basically takes Kubernetes and says, instead of you having to manage AWS virtual machines, you run your container, and just like you do with serverless, you just pay for what that container consumes. We'll take care of the underlying hardware for you. You don't have to mess with EC2 instances anymore. We'll take care of that for you. So their claim here that it's a fully managed Kubernetes service is especially true since that announcement and release in November around reInvent. And of course, they have a little tagline, the most trusted way to run Kubernetes. That might be true, actually. Based on the state of the DevOps State of Kubernetes Adoption Report, that actually might be a true statement. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about some of the features of Kubernetes. All right. So obviously, if you're using EKS and you're using a managed service, you've now got high availability, especially if you follow AWS best practices. So if you're using Fargate, the Fargate launch type, which is the serverless launch type, which serverless mainly, by the way, when you hear serverless, just think hidden servers. Don't think it doesn't have any servers, right? So the EKS control plane and data planes, which I'll talk about in a second, they run across redundant infrastructure inside of AWS. Obviously, with Fargate, which I just talked about, you now have a serverless option, so you don't have to worry about managing the EC2 instances anymore and patch, like that's handled for you. AWS takes care of the underlying infrastructure, and all you pay for is what your container is actually consuming. The service is also secure because you can apply the latest service patches, and you can even upgrade to the latest revisions. That's not always as seamless as it is, say, with other services like GKE or even AKS, but mainly GKE is better at it than I think EKS is. But it's secure, so you can apply patches and update. And of course, patches are applied live all the time to make sure that things stay healthy. And then, of course, it's Kubernetes conformant. So, Amazon's part of the CNCF, so the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Kubernetes is in alignment with that. So they use official, certified Kubernetes distributions that run, any standard tool that works on Kubernetes will work on EKS, assuming you have access. Catch. So, let's see. So if you think about it, you provision a cluster, you launch the cluster with a particular launch type, let's say Fargate if you want to do serverless, or just an EC2 launch type if you just want to manage and control your nodes. Then you connect to EKS, using certain tools, which we'll talk about. And then you run it like you run any Kubernetes cluster. You use kubectl to apply and create and do whatever, and it just works, right? So EKS is a managed service, and it's really simple to use. It's not necessarily simple to set up, but don't worry, we have an answer for that. All right, so let's talk about a few more features. I'm gonna do a little comparison, and then we'll roll into a demo. All right, so again, this is managed. So that means the control plane, which is the masters, is the master nodes that I was talking about earlier, and the application nodes, which are also known as the worker nodes, those are all fully managed. Amazon does charge you, I think it's 10 cents per hour per node for the master nodes, but they do that because they have an SLA attached to their master nodes. So oddly enough, Google is starting to copy them by starting to, they're going to charge in the summer for their master nodes, and they're also going to add an SLA to their master nodes. Microsoft doesn't do that at all. Matter of fact, Microsoft's installation is good. It could use some work, and they're working on it. So don't get me wrong, they're all going to stay competitive with each other, but they could use a little extra. Right now, GKE is probably the best, but EKS is right there, right behind it. So when you launch, one of the features, by the way, is that when you launch EKS, you use this tool called EKS CTL, or EKS Control. So EKS Control is actually jointly developed by a company called Weaveworks, which is really popular around GitOps, which is basically running operations out of a Git repository. And they worked with Amazon to write a tool called EKS, and their documentation's all over Amazon's website. So you can download the binary. I will show you kind of a mock run of EKS, but there's a great workshop link that I am going to make sure that you've all seen, that you've all got memorized before you leave today, that will give you a workshop where you can work with EKS and work with EKS CTL in depth. And if you do even like half of the labs that are in this workshop link, you will be on your way to a demigod with Kubernetes, just frankly, or particularly EKS. In addition, because you're leveraging Amazon, AWS, which I would argue that the cloud providers, but particularly Amazon, first and foremost, they're a security company. You don't get to $34 billion a year and that many customers, especially in 2006 when Gartner was like, nobody's going to use cloud until we solve the security problem and not be a security company. So AWS is really, first and foremost, from my perspective, a security company. And so that has more and more that mentality has injected itself into the EKS cluster. So you're seeing improvements on security all the time. And, Kubernetes is like a 4 or 5 year old software. And if you count when it hit like 1.0, it's probably younger than that. So it's not VMware. VMware has been around for, almost 20 years. They came out in 2002, 2003. And that's a mature, solid, battle-tested software. Kubernetes and Docker, they've only been around for less than a decade. And so while I'm not necessarily saying that they're not as secure, there are some holes and some things to work out because they're moving fast and there's technology emerging. But when it comes to EKS, you'll see that there are more and more security policies being applied, more security features being added. You also get to use service mesh and service discovery intrinsic with Elastic Kubernetes Service. So if you've not used Cloud Map, that's a way of it's like a discovery service, a service discovery service. Is that a word? And you can also use AppMesh, which basically makes it basically enables like an Istio style service mesh, so that it can export metrics and logs. It can do circuit breaking. It can do traffic routing. It can do retries. So Istio can sometimes be an over and above complexity sandwich, like service mesh over Kubernetes. And AppMesh is a way that they're trying to work to make that simpler for people to get to service mesh. So if you're using microservices, you're almost guaranteed to be using containers and guaranteed to be using Kubernetes. So service mesh and service discovery are other features that get added to EKS as a result. EKS, by the way, does allow you to use your own VPC security groups and NACLs, which are kind of stateful and stateless firewalls for AWS. They tend to keep everything private, so it's not available unless it's through like a NAC gateway. And you can also, they're basically, instead of using KubeNet, they're using VPC CNI to manage the networking when it comes to their Kubernetes clusters. They do enable Calico if you want to apply some kind of policy to it, so you can enable like fine-grained networking policies. So you do have Calico if you want to add that into your Kubernetes clusters on EKS. In addition, the EKS Kubernetes installation has an IAM authenticator, which actually runs local on your system, which is kind of cool, which can enable role-based access control for Kubernetes. And of course, you can use service accounts because everything in AWS, to a certain degree, can use service accounts, so it makes sense. One cool thing that people ask me a lot is that, does Kubernetes support Windows? The answer is yes. And guess what? Most of the providers support Windows as well, which we'll look at. So as of October of last year, Windows nodes are now supported in Amazon EKS, starting with Kate's version 1.14. Kate's, by the way, is shorthand for Kubernetes. So Kubernetes version 1.14. So, if you're running that version of your nodes in EKS, you can actually add Windows nodes into a mixed cluster type. We already talked about serverless, but I do want to mention this because I think this is important. Most people don't know this, but Amazon Outposts is basically the ability to have Amazon hardware in your data center. So you can have RDS and EC2 and caching and like you can have a bunch of services in your data center. If you go through Outposts and get through an Outpost approved hardware vendor, you can actually have everything that you use to manage your AWS infrastructure in the cloud today can actually be used to extend down to AWS hardware running into your data center. So that includes EKS. So if you're running Outpost hardware inside of your on-premise data center, you can manage that just like you manage any of your AWS infrastructure. It's just an extension, right? And it's on the container hardware, the Outpost hardware that's in your data center. So if you're like, well, I really need EKS inside my data center, I need Kubernetes in my data center, and I can't do that in the cloud, you can always run Outpost hardware and get the power and capability and progression and support of AWS EKS in your local data center. Now, I made that sound trivial, by the way. We all have a bunch of security and legal compliances that have to happen to make that happen, but it can happen, and it's pretty amazing when it does, when you've done that, because all the operational overhead that you were dealing with before, except for power and cooling, it to a certain degree, it kind of like goes away. It's interesting. Obviously, networking and other pieces are still there, but just know that you have that option. And then you can turn on CloudTrail and CloudWatch. You can see everything going on inside your cluster. So that's extremely useful. Obviously, CloudTrail allows you to see every API call made against your account if you have the stream enabled to do so. And CloudWatch is just a metrics repository. But you can react to that metrics repository, and you can push custom logs to that repository, but you can look in those two options, and you can see everything that's happening for the most part with the Kubernetes clusters. Sometimes seeing inside the pods themselves where the actual containers are running, that requires a little bit of a deeper dive. Oh, that looks like a duplicate. Ignore logging at the top, that's a duplicate. It is certified conformant, as I mentioned before, so this is official Kubernetes, like from the source. And then, excuse me, Amazon does allow you to do cluster updates a little more seamlessly than they did before. So they are progressing that because they support the latest 3 stable Kubernetes versions, and they'll allow you to update them at any time. And by the way, I'll show you in the console later, but you can literally click a button and update. It'll do a rolling update of your cluster. So pretty cool. Last 2 things. So EKS does support GPU enabled instances, for example. This comes up a lot because one of the early adoption cases that I see a lot for environments is that when your data science team or your machine learning team wants access to a Kubernetes cluster because they picked up a third-party tool, or they're just writing Jupyter notebooks that are hot, heavy, and fast, and so they want to be able to spin that infrastructure up, run their models, get the output, and then run another model. So they want the ability to experiment fast, and containers are kind of ideal for that, right? So when they need Kubeflow or whatever they're using, high performance computing, then adding different kind of machine image types that can specialize for those roles is essential, and EKS can support that. And of course, EKS will support all your open source tools such as Helm and whatnot, whatever you're using. Cool. Just checking for a moment to see if there's any questions. Let's see. There's the link. Link to report didn't show in the specific chat. Yeah, Thomas, don't worry, I'll link that in. I was having trouble finding it. I might have posted the wrong document, just to be upfront about it. I might have posted the state of DevOps, and I might need to make sure that's the right one. Yeah, so Subash, it's funny because I've actually taught a webinar on that before. Subash asked me, he said, by the way, can you compare EKS versus ECS? So just to say this is that they both have similar options. So they have a Fargate launch type, ECS does. ECS, by the way, is the Elastic Container Service. So it was there before Kubernetes kind of, in a sense, won the orchestrator war. And ECS is interesting because ECS just hosts containers, but it has similar types in that you have an EC2 launch type for ECS, and you have a Fargate launch type. Fargate was that, that add-on that also got added to the Kubernetes service that said, I don't want to manage my EC2 infrastructure. I don't want to manage virtual machines. I just want to run my containers, charge me for what the container consumes, but don't make me patch my system or worry about hosts, and no, I don't want to do that. So Fargate exists both in ECS and in EKS. What's the difference? The main difference is Kubernetes. So ECS, you don't really get a lot of interaction with the backend infrastructure because it's just there to host containers. And it's not really based on open source from what we know that Amazon's revealed. So you can't get in there through the command line and manipulate the backend. You can push stuff through task definitions to ECS. So it works, it's proprietary, and it works very different than the Elastic's Kubernetes service. The Elastic Kubernetes service is based on open source. And so that's the real distinction and difference, is that all of your tools and community stuff that works for Kubernetes will work with EKS. It will not work with ECS. Is that a negative? I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, I like the Elastic Container Service. I think it's a great service. I think it functions flawlessly. But I think that if you're looking for multi-cloud and you're looking for homogeneity between your data center and between AWS, I don't think ECS is going to be your service. I think people, from what I hear from a lot of enterprises, is we're all super concerned about vendor lock-in. I don't know why, because every design decision you make typically has some kind of vendor lock-in associated with it, whether it's a Spring framework or this library, or whether you're using, Ansible versus Chef versus Puppet. It all has some kind of cost to it, right? That you invest into the system. So I think people, though, are really like highly sensitive to the optics of being locked into a vendor, and so they're using Kubernetes as this abstraction layer that says, well, if I can run Kubernetes in Amazon, that means eventually I could run it in Microsoft, and I could run it in Google, and I could run it on my on-premise data center, which isn't necessarily easily done. It is true that you can do that, but that's the real difference, is that EKS has Kubernetes into it, and so you can actually pull that out and run plain vanilla Kubernetes, and all of the community tools that work with Kubernetes will work with EKS. They won't work with ECS with the Elastic Container Service. Does that answer your question? I don't have a visual, but that's, in a summary, they are remarkably alike, but that's the difference. Okay. Any other questions before I blow you away with information? Hopefully I blow you away. Hey, hopefully you get this chart. So this comes, by the way, from a company called StackRox. I did not make this up. I'm just going to be upfront about it because I am not a fan of reinventing the wheel. StackRox is a container security company. I have no affiliation with them whatsoever. Zero, right? I just want you to know where I got this from, because I like credit where credit is due, right? These guys made this great little chart, and they have a great blog post in this. I believe it's actually in interesting links. If it's not, I'll make sure it's there. But take a look at this. Like, this is interesting, right? So we've got EKS on the left with Amazon. We've got Microsoft's AKS, the Azure Kubernetes Service. We've got the Google Kubernetes Engine with Google. And then we've just got plain vanilla open source Kubernetes. What you notice is that, Amazon's supporting 3 versions, including what they consider the not latest release, because 1.17 I think is out. Obviously we're up to 18 in alpha, right? But they're like 2 or 3 releases back. Why? I actually think this is smart, by the way. Particularly with Kubernetes, my advocation is that you want to probably be 2, maybe 3 cycles back from latest release. And Amazon, oddly enough, is following that, and they didn't ask me. They're just doing it, right? So you see 1.14 there, which is the default when you launch a new cluster, and they've got 1.13 and 1.12. Now, I think 1.12 is end of life, end of support here pretty soon, so they're probably going to roll forward to 1.15 pretty quickly. But you notice the others all are pretty much doing the same thing. Some of them have already rolled forward, obviously, into 1.15 already. But notice that Google's default is 1.13, and Azure's is 1.14, just like AWS. Obviously, 1.18 is out in alpha, so so you can see the difference in how they support minor versions. Google, by the way, has been around with their version of Kubernetes since 2015, so they've had a managed service for quite some time. And notice that they came out with theirs a month after Kubernetes hit 1.0, right? So Amazon and Microsoft, being in that competitive space, all came out with theirs in June of 2018, all really close to each other. They're all conformant with open source Kubernetes. And then, of course, the latest CNCF certified version that they actually use, the CNCF, by the way, is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. If you are in operations or in this space, you're interested, make sure you're watching the CNCF. The CNCF, especially their graduated programs, graduates some of the more cutting edge software that everyone seems to love and adopt. So Kubernetes is one of them. But you notice they're all using 1.14. And then Google is the best at automatically upgrading the clusters. With EKS, you've got to initiate it, but it does actually do it. Like it manually runs it, right? You also do have to manually update the services on the nodes. Amazon's changing that and fixing it. And then, of course, AKS just has a user initiation and it just kind of does it. So there's a little bit of manual work with EKS that you have to do whenever you want to do an upgrade. The node upgrade process, if you've got a managed node group, then if you're using Fargate, for example, Amazon take care of that for you, right? I'm sorry. There's two node types for EC2. There's managed and unmanaged, so it's not Fargate, sorry. It's the EC2 launch type. If you're doing a managed node group, which a node group is a cluster of, EC2 types, if it's managed, then it will do it for you. If it's unmanaged, then you're gonna have to do it yourself. So you gotta follow the standard procedures to upgrade Kubernetes. Recommendation, use Fargate. If you're gonna use a managed service, just go for the fully managed service. I mean, do you really need control? If you have a use case for it, then run your own EC2 instances. But most of the time, we just want to run our applications. We don't have to sit there and manage virtual machines. I got plenty of virtual machines to manage. If I want to do that, I can go grab my Raspberry Pis at home and do my thing. But even in production, I still typically have plenty of virtual machines to manage. If you're going to use EKS, my recommendation is just experiment with the Fargate type. Ignore this whole thing, and just when you do an upgrade, just let it handle it all for you. You'll also see the container runtimes are Docker mainly. Moby Docker, by the way, is just the community version of Docker. And then you'll see Containerd over there, which is another container runtime. Creo is another runtime. Rocket's another runtime. You'll see the over on the right-hand side. And then, of course, the control planes are all highly available. The only catch there is just to say this is that Microsoft does not state what their redundancy measures are inside of their control plane documentation, and that's a little squirrely. I'm assuming they have redundancy, but we don't know, and they won't state it. They're not really answering questions. I hope they fix that because it's getting a little bit of attention, honestly. Let's see. EKS has a SLA for their particular service, and actually, I'm going to do a little annotation here so you can see what I'm talking about. You're like, Michael, where are you at? So right now, I'm right here where this red arrow is about the control plane. And because they have a 99.9% SLA on it, it is financially backed. Funny thing, Google's about to make theirs financially backed as of June because AWS was doing it. And this, by the way, is why they're charging 10 cents an hour, EKS is, for their cluster plus the standard cost of EC2 instances, because they're charging for the masters because they have an SLA around them. All of them support GPUs, right? All of them support log collection. They're all sent to a variety of different services. So in that way, they're very similar. All right, check to make sure there's no questions. Looks like we're doing good. All right, so this looks like a repeat. Let's not do that again. We've already done that. All right, so what about service limits? So service limits don't apply to Kubernetes because their service limit is whatever the Kubernetes clusters and masters will support. But you can get about 100 clusters per region. And for managed node groups, it's about 1,000 max nodes per cluster. But notice it changes for Azure and it changes for GKE. GKE, by the way, You can get 5,000 if you're not using a GKE Angus controller. That's a lot of application nodes. That's a lot of worker nodes. I gotta tell you, I don't know that I've run in production more than, I would say, a couple hundred worker nodes. And you know, I can think of tons of use cases where that would be useful. I start segmenting clusters, honestly, at that point in time for different use cases, for different applications. So there's a variety of other limits here. You probably would need to read the EKS documentation to know like what the limits mean as far as node groups and all the other pieces. ENIs, by the way, are network interfaces. So you might have some limits on the number of pods that you can run per node. Because if you run a smaller node type, you're going to get less pods per node. If you run a larger node type, you're going to get more. And that's about bandwidth and the number of network interfaces that you can attach, because each of those is going to be attaching IP addresses. So just something to know about that you're going to want to dive into if you want to know more about how this is going to function in EKS. Now, networking security-wise, which is super important, EKS is going to run the VPC CNI, which is their container network interface. All the others can use KubeNet, which is kind of the default, but you can add CNIs to Kubernetes all you want, but you can't really do it for EKS, AKS, or GKE. You have to use KubeNet. You can add network policies like Calico, right? They're not necessarily enabled by default for any of the particular vendors. So like this particular line right here. Role-based access control is required in EKS because, as I said before, Amazon is a security company. So they're going to require you to turn on role-based access control. You cannot have an unaccess controlled cluster. It is enabled by default for the other vendors, but you can also disable it if you so desire. The rest of this covers things like how do we do pod security policies? Can you get public IP addresses for the nodes? Yes, you can actually get public IP addresses for the nodes for EKS. You can't really do it for the other providers, which I'm not really sure why. And of course, Kubernetes, you can do whatever you want if you're running in your own data center. Is pod-to-pod traffic encrypted by the cloud? Nope, not unless you enable some kind of service mesh. You obviously have a firewall for the API, which means that you can restrict it. So like you can only run it, for example, like say from my house or from your corporate office or wherever. They don't have a read-only root file system on the node, not yet. I will say this, Google does, but I think Amazon actually just released this recently, so they're actually coming out with this pretty quickly. Cool. All right. Does anyone have any questions? That was a lot of features that we covered. I think the main thing to know is that it's here. You can read it if you want to look up limits and understand how this functions. And just know that 1.14 is the default pretty much for all of them, except for Google, which is running at 1.13. Cool. All right. Don't see anything popping up. No one has given voice to anything. So let's talk about the EKS workshop. If you have not seen this thing, it's a public lab that you can actually get to on the EKS documentation. Let me show you what that looks like. I will get out of this. All right. So if you're on, hold on. Let me make sure I'm sharing everything properly. There we go. Awesome. All right. So let's say you're here and you've found the EKS documentation for Amazon. You're like, hey, this looks pretty good. Now, of course, it'll say start because it says start for all the products. But over here, you'll find things like the blog highlights. But there's this little link to called EKS Workshop. And when you click on EKS Workshop, this is like a little hidden gem. It's a little bit like the DevOps Handbook. The DevOps Handbook, by the way, at the end of the DevOps Handbook has a little paragraph titled "The Dirty Little Secret of the DevOps Handbook." And I teach like book clubs and cyber classes on DevOps. And it says at the end of the DevOps Handbook, it says the dirty little secret of the DevOps Handbook is that everybody who initiated these organizational changes, once they moved on to another company or were promoted, the organizational changes rolled back. And then it talks about like why change is hard and all those other pieces. Well, here we are with another dirty little secret, and that AWS has kind of an unlisted workshop that you can take for EKS, which is awesome. Be prepared. So what this does is that over on the left-hand side, and I think the guy's name is Brent Connor. I find his handiwork all over the ECS and EKS workshops. He's created this amazing container workshop that you can do in your own Amazon account. It'll probably cost you about $20, $25 to do all like 30 hours worth of labs. But as I mentioned before, if you do all of these labs, you will be way ahead of the curve when it comes to knowing how these things function. It's just simply amazing. Bear with me just one second. John asked a question. John Zubash asked a question. He said, since Fargate is allowing serverless, why would anyone pick EC2? Are there major limitations of Fargate? I don't know if there's major limitations of Fargate. If you need like mixed node types, that might be an issue. If you want something outside of band, there's no major limitations of Fargate other than it kind of favors homogeneity of types. Obviously, if Amazon's making upgrade decisions and other decisions that you don't necessarily like, and you have to have patching or control, or if you even just want access to the operating system to be able to change some of the cores of Kubernetes, you might want EC2. But for the most part, I will tell you that Fargate doesn't have any major limitations except for edge use cases. But mileage varies. People have needs. So, don't take that as a blanket statement that Fargate has no limitations. It does. But for the in particular environment, I can't really predict what those limitations might be that would restrict people from using Fargate. Okay, so back to the EKS workshop, which actually I just posted in chat. So here we are at the EKS workshop, and it's basically step-by-step on how you get started with Kubernetes. So I just clicked on the introduction, but let's say you want to start the workshop and you want to run the workshop in your own account. If you're at an AWS event, by the way, it's a different process, but it'll walk you through creating an account, which is awesome. If you don't have a free account already, or if your business is not allowing you to have an account, you might want to create a free account. And then it walks you on how to create a workspace, which I think I have a workspace up already. Let's see, where did I put this thing? That's strange. I did have it up. Bear with me just one second. Oh, here it is. Probably paused because I was away from it. My EC2 instance was stopped, so I was talking for a long time. So let's see. Cancel that, close that. Let's get back to the root here. So here we are, and this walks you through creating what's called a Cloud9 workspace. That's just Amazon's like Cloud IDE, which is pretty useful for interacting with, creating like a consistent environment to interact with AWS. But it walks you through installing tools. It walks you through creating an IAM role. It walks you for setting up your service workspace, and then it gives you service like application repos that you can clone if you want to practice deploying stuff in EKS. So what I did before the class started is I actually went through and I launched an EKS cluster using EKS CTL. So I actually started a cluster, and I started a 3-node cluster. And so if I click in through my console, what you'll see, so I go to EKS and I look at clusters, you'll see that I created an EKS workshop cluster. It's actually running 1.14. So this is the AWS console. And if I click on update now, it will actually like roll it forward, but I didn't think 1.15 was available, so it kind of threw me off when I actually saw this. I haven't clicked on it because I didn't want to mess up my demo, but I probably will as soon as I get done just to see what it does. Because I've done it for 1.13 to 1.14, but I haven't done it for 1.14 up to 1.15, which I think is what they're suggesting that they can do. And then if I click in to the cluster details itself, I can see the version, I can see the platform version, I can see its status, I can see my certificate authority. You guys can be like, oh, we're going to hack this guy. He's sharing all his information. You can see the node groups that I have inside the system, including the AMI that was used. And right now I have a 3-node cluster. So I have one in each of the availability zones that I'm currently cruising in. I do have a Fargate profile, even though I don't think I have any nodes in my Fargate profile. I just kind of left it alone for a second. And then these are the various subnets and pieces that I use. 3 of these subnets are private. 3 of these subnets are public. I'm using private subnets because I'm not exposing anything to the internet. but it also shows things like how you can find logging, and then any updates or tags, which honestly I kind of did bad practice there. You typically launch tags on your resources so you can run good reports and stuff like that. But this is the result of running that EKS command. I'm going to close this. Of running this EKS create cluster command. Now, it took about 15 minutes, and I already had region defined, which was US East 2. You could actually just type in US East 2 in there if you want to see it, right? And I already checked the role and set my permissions and did all this other cool stuff to make sure that it was going to function. So the EKSworkshop.com is a great resource. And before I actually do a demo, just to show you like me creating, how you interact with it and all those other pieces, I just want to mention that if you click on beginner, you can see things like how to deploy the dashboard, how to deploy the microservices, how to get Helm 3 working, which I believe, if I remember correctly, doesn't use Tiller anymore. How to do health checks, how to do auto scaling, how to do role-based access control. These labs, step by step, will walk you in detail about how to drive your knowledge even deeper inside AWS EKS service. Just so you're aware, shameless plug, next week, I'm going to be walking people through these labs online, with me, because I've actually done it before, and, I'm kind of an expert at it, and I know exactly how it works, and, I'm a Kubernetes specialist, and so I'm going to be walking people off of these webinars next week, where are going to be little 4-hour, 8-hour workshops where we just crush Kubernetes and dive deeper. So let's see. Someone asked me if I could make the fonts bigger. Charles, does that help? I hope so. Cool. Hope that makes it bigger. So you can expose a service, you can practice with spot instances, you can deploy microservices to Fargate, so you can do the Fargate version versus the EC2 version. You can do stateful microservices using the Elastic file system. By the way, Amazon just recently released Lustre for Kubernetes, which allows you to, again, share a central file system across all your Linux and, Windows clusters. You can manage secrets, and that's just under beginners. If I click under intermediate, it's going to deploy Jenkins. You're going to learn how to do a CI/CD pipeline. You'll get to do EFK, which is Elasticsearch, Fluentd, and Kibana. We'll show you how to do tracing. So if those of you are familiar with Jaeger, you might be familiar with X-Ray, which is Amazon's tracing tool. And then you can set up metrics and visualizations with Prometheus and Grafana. We'll show you how to use weave-flux. And then under advanced, it doesn't stop there. It just keeps going. Under advanced, you get to set up a service mesh with Istio, and you can do service mesh with app mesh, and then you can do batch processing with Argo, or you can actually mess with Kubeflow if you're into machine learning. So this EKS workshop link gives you probably, I would say, like maybe 20 to 30 hours of amazing training over EKS. So I highly recommend that if you got some time and a free account and you're someone who's going to be supporting or working with Kubernetes, or you just want to know more about it, this workshop is spectacular. And kudos to AWS for publishing this whole thing. All right, so let's go back to beginner, and I'll do my little demo. Let's go back to beginner. Let's say we want to, deploy the Kubernetes dashboard, which actually I think I might have already deployed, but let's see. So I'm going to go back to my Cloud9 instance. And if you're not familiar with Cloud9, and I totally apologize because the fonts here are going to be horrific, but I'm going to blow it up as much as I can, right? Hopefully it's pretty big there. If, oops, no application seems to be running here. What's going on? So let's say that I'm doing the beginning lab and I want to deploy the Kubernetes dashboard. So this is the dashboard. It's not necessarily recommended that you run this in production, but we're messing around. So let's see how it goes. And so I think I already ran this kubectl apply command to deploy and apply the deployment of the dashboard. So I'm going to run this kubectl proxy command again, just to see if that's the case. Yeah. Okay, good. Starting to serve. We're good there. All right. I'm going to go back to the workshop. And so what's going to happen is that because I put kubectl as a proxy and bound it to port 8080, it's going to listen for basically anybody trying to get to 8080 on the local host. And so I definitely want to attach to that. So what I'll do is I'll come back to my arena here, and I'll go to Tools, Preview, and I'm going to preview a running application. I'm going to put my URL in here. Oh, it ran there for a second. But now it's giving me a security challenge, and it's saying, hey, by the way, how are you going to access this? And so the workshop's going to walk me through getting my token. So I'm going to come back over here and run AWS EKS get token. Note, by the way, this does require 1.18 of the command line tools. So don't make the mistake of not listening to the workshop and installing 1.16 or 1.17. It won't work, right? So just FYI, make sure you're following the instructions, because if you don't, it won't work. So for those of you security minded, you could steal my token if you really wanted to. I'm going to enter the token over here, and then what should happen is that now all of a sudden I am in full screen, right, in my dashboard. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. All right, and so I deployed the dashboard. I now have access. I can now click around the dashboard if I see fit, and I can now go in and look at nodes, which I can see that there's 3 nodes here, right, barely used. I can look at namespaces if any have been created, which only the defaults are here, so that's not a big deal. I can look at any particular like roles that I have, like Bootstrapper or Fargate Manager or whatnot. And so I've got the web interface if I want to click through it. But let's say I want to do some meat and I want to deploy some applications. Okay, well, guess what? So the workshop walks us through. First, it shows us the deployment files, right? So we're doing a deployment. Here's some metadata, the name, the label of the app, namespace, the default namespace, how many replicas I have, anything I want to do around rolling updates, any limitations around surges or making things unavailable, the metadata for the template, and then of course the source, which in this case is by this lovely gentleman who's publishing this workshop, and then the name of it and the port it's going to listen to. So it shows me the file that it's running. And then I can come right over here, and I'm just going to copy this whole thing just to make it simple, and I can just paste this into the workshop, and what it does is it's now created a deployment, and then it's exposed a service. Where did it get these from? Well, if I look inside, well, actually I'm already there, right? If I look inside, and I can go in here and cat these files if I want to, or more them. Sorry, all of a sudden I can't type. I can more these files and see exactly what's going on. And they basically match what I looked at. So we deployed them, but I want to see if it actually really deployed, right? And so I'm going to run the specific command. Oops. I'm going to run the specific command, or honestly, I could just run deployment, quite frankly, and it would show me everything that's been installed, right? Straightforward, easy. Let's say I want to deploy the Crystal backend. Same thing. Just cut and paste. I can actually list all my deployments. Guess what? Crystal is there now. Same thing with the third one. This one's a front end, right? So this one, though, is going to be a front end load balancer. So I already checked, by the way, this service role does exist. But what we can do here is that I want to bring up the Ruby front end. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and deploy the Ruby front end as well. And I'm going to go ahead and look at the deployments just to see what's happening. And I've got 3 deployments now, all set up. So I've got my front end, I've got my node deployment, and I've got my Crystal deployment all running, and they've all got one replica. They're all like up to date. Now, as part of the lab, because I can see they're actually ready, as part of the lab, I might want to like look at the service and do some kind of investigation and find out exactly what the service is doing. And here we see that's a load balancer. There's a cluster IP to it, and it's actually redirecting port 80 to 30,020, right? It's been up about 30 seconds. Then, we notice that I'm not getting the fully qualified domain name because I'm probably going to need that to connect to the system. Ah, look at that. There it is. And so in this particular case, I'm going to do a quick curl against it just to make sure. Ooh, can't do it. What's going on? Uh-oh, the demo failed. As expected. Could not resolve host. Does that match who I'm seeing here? A13. It might still be coming up. Let's see what the deployment says. Looks like they're all ready. Not sure what's going on there. Anyway, moving on, just to not inhibit things. So it actually worked when I ran it earlier, because I did actually check it before I came on and ran a demo. And for some reason, that's not working. What it does is it actually runs through all the services and shows you exactly the HTML. I'm not sure why it's belling up, but I probably something I did when I was troubleshooting something earlier. Now, the other thing is that I might want to scale these. So if you want to practice on that, you just come back in here. I'm going to make this so everybody can see it. Let's not do that. So let's say I want to go from 1 replica to 3. And if I go and look at the deployments again, we'll see that it's now stepping up from 1 of 1 to now 2 of 3. And in a second, it'll say 3 of 3. And so I can do the same thing if I want to go over to the crystal, and I can scale that one as well. If I look at the deployment, it's 1 of 3. And now it's 3 of 3. So this is all included in the lab. And the great thing is, by the way, is that I love this workshop because, oh, and here it is, by the way, showing us how to scale the front end as well. I love this workshop because one of the things he always does, he said, we got to clean it up, got to clean your account up, right? Got to delete your stuff, right? Unless you're going to continue. So it shows you how to basically undo everything you did inside the account if you need to make sure that everything is deleted, which is very nice. So that's an example of running the EKS workshop system in order to learn more about EKS and Kubernetes. So I highly recommend that when you get a chance, you run that URL, you dive into it, you spend some time, maybe carve out like 30 minutes or an hour a day, and just run through one of the labs on these levels and just take them one at a time. Maybe one day you do the Kubernetes dashboard, which takes all of 5 minutes, and then you do the example microservices, but then you might dive into Helm. And by the way, this is version 3 of Helm, in case you're wondering. And you might walk through this for 15 minutes. So I recommend that you spend a little bit of time each day running through the different labs in the workshop. And don't get me wrong, you might have to pause and stop the cluster and restart it because you don't want to eat all those resources all the time. But especially if you have a long period of time, you can actually run through the entire lab in about, it takes about, I would say 20 to 30 hours to really run through the whole thing. If you're interested in having a coach or a guide with that, just know that next week we're going to be hosting a hands-on 4 and 8 hour workshop where we walk through the beginner, the intermediate, and the advanced portions of this. I'll answer questions along the way. I'll tell you what service mesh is. So just know that that's available as well. All right. Any questions? Okay. All right. So let's wrap it up because we're reaching the end, and I want to leave space for questions if there are any, and there may not be any, but I like to think people might want to ask them. So what's next? So let's just do a quick review of everything that we've looked at. Okay. So the goal here was to showcase EKS and give you a short demo for deploying an application on EKS. We talked about me, which didn't really matter, right? And I showed you some collateral of things to look at. And I will make sure, by the way, that the DevOps report is out there that shows the adoption. But if you look up State of DevOps, EKS, Kubernetes, you'll definitely find it, but I'll make sure it's in the link as well. We talked about just briefly about what Kubernetes was. We talked in depth about EKS and some of the features, including Fargate versus EC2. We talked about things like how to run serverless and how it manages control planes and data planes. We talked about this new tool, EKS-CTL, which is used to launch your Kubernetes clusters in EKS. We mentioned things like service discovery and service mesh. Service mesh is like Istio, right? But it's called app mesh, and AWS uses it. Remember, in the workshop, they cover Istio and they cover app mesh. So if you want to see a comparison of both, you've got an opportunity to do so. In addition, we talked about the IAM authenticator and just service accounts and how there's VPC support, so you get native integration with EKS. EKS does support Windows. We did talk about how there's now an ability to deploy EKS on-premise by using AWS Outposts, and that you can do logging and metrics tracking inside of EKS using CloudWatch and CloudTrail, respectively. We also talked about how they're all standardized at 114. It is official Kubernetes conformant. And we did a loose verbal comparison between the container service and the Kubernetes service. I did mention that they all support basically GPU workloads, and that EKS, unlike ECS, works great with all of your open source tools. ECS doesn't really work with your open source tools because it's not Kubernetes. It's a proprietary container service. And then we did a little comparison. This came from StackRox. This is actually inside of your collateral link, which you got at the beginning of the workshop. And notice they're all defaulting on 114 except for Google, which is defaulting to 113. And there's a variety of numbers and metrics here that are all going to change by the time I get done saying this, about SLAs and number of nodes supported, and does it support GPUs, and does it support Windows. And so just know that you can find this information and know that it's out there, right? And then we went through networking security, and then I did a short demo, and this is the real thing I wanted you to take away, is that you have the EKSworkshop.com cemented in your brain, has something that you are using, that you're testing your skills, acquiring new information and knowledge. It will require you to have an AWS account, so I recommend that you get a free account, put a credit card behind it, and just put some service limits, some budgeting alarms around it to make sure that it doesn't exceed. Bottom line, if you decide to run the workshop yourself, just delete your resources when you're done. I probably spent $1 over the last few hours getting all those resources to function. $1, maybe, maybe. So just be aware that it's not going to cost you a whole lot as long as you keep an eye on it. But if you walk away from it and you decide to start a beefy machine, I mean, you could spend a couple dollars an hour. Don't worry, you're not going to drop 1,000 unless you do something crazy, right? But know that this EKS workshop is here. It's awesome. I highly recommend that you dive into it. And if you want a partner to do it with you, we got something coming up. So just FYI. All right. Then we did a demo, and here we are. So Web-based solutions, we do a bunch of training, just so you know. I'm Michael Forrester. And so that is technically the end. And so, and ignore the implications of violence here. Do you have any questions that you want to ask either verbally or through chat? A little Jeopardy. Dun, 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 dun. I'm actually working on a Jeopardy game for Kubernetes. So next time I run this webinar, you will all get to participate, if you so desire, into a Kubernetes Jeopardy game. So good. Well, things seem pretty quiet. I don't even want to top it. Let's see. Oh, good questions. Let's see. All right. Is there a unified orchestrator tool in development for EKS, AKS that we can investigate to deploy across 3 clouds, plus maybe on-prem, that have an outpost? Thomas, that is a great question. I would say that whatever your configuration management tool is of choice is probably going to be your great unifier for deploying Kubernetes across all your cloud providers. But no one has solved that problem that doesn't come with a very expensive price tag. There are companies out there who are trying to solve it, but they charge kind of an arm and a leg. But from an open source perspective, there's tools like COPS, which actually only covers, I believe, AWS and GKE. I don't think it covers AWS. I'm sorry, AKS. Kubespray, like there's been attempts at that, but they don't necessarily work exceptionally well. So bottom line is that if you're using Chef or Puppet or Terraform or Ansible, and don't get me wrong, Terraform is a slightly different beast than the other 3, but Terraform is probably going to be your unifying provider for being able to spin up and do this across all 3 providers, but there is no easy tool to do that now. So don't have a good answer for you yet, but I promise you somebody's trying to figure that out. Let's see. Shumna I'm sorry, Shushma was asking me, should I know AWS before you jump on EKS? No. What you should know is that if you create a free account on AWS, probably the one thing you want to do is make sure you go to the billing center first and make sure you set any alarms or any budgeting thresholds that you want. That's probably the only other thing that you really need to know before you start messing with AWS. Don't get me wrong, you're going to touch IAM, which is the Identity and Access Management Service. In case you didn't realize it, I am an authorized Amazon trainer, so that's why I'm just rattling this stuff off. IAM is going to be required in order for you to get to EKS, but don't worry, the workshop will actually walk you through all of that. The only thing the workshop doesn't really cover is I would go set budget alarms first. I have not had a single person write to me and say, oh my God, Michael, you wrecked my life because you told me to go start an account and I spent thousands of dollars. That's not happened. I'm just telling you that because I want people to have peace of mind when they use AWS because it's utility computing. So if you set a budget alarm that says, I'm not going to spend more than $25, it will start notifying you if you start spending money, because that's where people get wrecked, right? Is that they leave resources running. So you don't need to know AWS to do EKS, but you do need to know that the workshop is going to walk you through a few things, and you need to probably look at the billing center and just make sure you can set alarms there. So let's see. Subash was asking, do you see people moving from ECS to EKS? To date, I have not had a single person ask me to help them with the migration. I've had a lot of people say, I don't really, like I'm interested in Kubernetes because everyone's talking about Kubernetes. But people who are on ECS tend to like ECS and they have workflows for ECS. Amazon probably has better numbers on that, but to date, I haven't been asked to help anybody with an ECS to EKS migration. EKS has a huge learning curve, and that's probably why, I'm sorry, I said that incorrectly. Kubernetes has a big learning curve. And so people who use ECS love ECS and they don't tend to change. And if they do decide to go towards Kubernetes, I highly recommend that they just invest the time. Create a long runway, spend 6 months, get your team trained, put a bunch of non-production Kubernetes like EKS workloads out there, mess with that, and then switch over because it's a much different beast. And so I'm not seeing a lot of migrations in that way. What do you think about Rancher on-prem versus EKS on Outpost? Oh, Charles, Rancher. I have a secret love affair with Rancher. I love Rancher. I love Rancher as a company. I love Rancher as a community contributor. I love Rancher has a global multi-cluster, orchestration management software for Kubernetes. So, like OpenShift is what most people talk about when they talk about like an enterprise version of Kubernetes that you could run on premise. But from my perspective, OpenShift is relatively expensive for what it does for Kubernetes. That being said, it's totally worth it if you're a large enterprise and you want IBM and Red Hat to support you as you deploy Kubernetes on premise. I think OpenShift is an awesome option. But you might be saying, Michael, why are you talking about OpenShift? I'm talking about OpenShift because OpenShift does like a bigger version of what Rancher does, but that might be unnecessary. Like OpenShift will install Jenkins and put all like EFK in place, and they'll put all this monitoring and other stuff in place, which you might already have, so you might not want to leverage what OpenShift provides. Rancher, on the other hand, offers a lot of the enhancement features that OpenShift does, but it does it at way cheaper. I mean, and let me be clear, this is list price. And if you ever hear me spout numbers, by the way, they're lies. You need to go look them up and talk to your rep. But like when I looked at the pricing between OpenShift and Rancher last time, OpenShift was $3,500 per core pair, not processor socket, per core pair. So that was at the highest level of platinum support that you could get for OpenShift. It was $3,500 per core pair. So I had a 16-core system, multiply 8 times $3,500 a year for support, and that's how much that server costs us to run OpenShift with platinum level support from Red Hat. Rancher, if memory serves, charges like I want to say it's like $50 a host. They don't care how, and it might be $150. So again, numbers, lies, right? But I think it was like maybe at max $150 a host list price, and we're talking about like we had hosts that had like 48 processors and a terabyte of memory on them. So I think Rancher for what it does has a better value. I also like Rancher because I think Rancher eases the deployment of Kubernetes on premise. Rancher, by the way, can also ease the deployment of Kubernetes in AWS, Azure, and GKE. So back to Thomas's question, because I was going to circle around to this, and Charles, I'm glad you asked this, is that I think Rancher is probably the closest and best value tool out there right now if you want to deploy Kubernetes yourself onto all of the cloud providers plus on-premise. I think Rancher is an amazing tool. Now, because Kubernetes is moving so fast, Rancher is also having to move fast as well. And so they might not have all the robustness and features, but they are it's an amazing product, and they're actually a good company to deal with. I love every one of those guys is sharp, and I love dealing with them. So I think Rancher is a good option if you're looking for some kind of tool that might help you with your deployment and creation of multi-tenanted, multi-cloud, multi-location Kubernetes clusters. Wow, that was a lot of talking. All right. So, any other questions? Great questions there, by the way. All right. Well, I'm going to post the link just one more time in case somebody missed it, but this will get you to the Google Drive share. We're going to send an email out in case you missed it with the recording. We're going to send it out with all the links. We're going to send out a PDF copy of the slide deck. So you'll have everything if you missed it, and this is going to be recorded as well. So if you have any questions, you know how to reach me. I'm at peopleforrester or michael.forrester@webhsolutions.com. And it's been a pleasure to teach, and thank you for your questions and your participation. You guys have been fabulous. So thank you so much. I'm going to linger around and answer any chat questions that come up, but otherwise I hope you have a fabulous day. Stay healthy, stay sane in this global pandemic that we're dealing with, and we'll catch you next time.